So I gave this talk, the first time I gave this talk was 3 years ago. I had been at Stripe for about 3 or 4 months. We were in our cafeteria in our old office. I had to order the pizza myself. I don't even know if we signed people in. Hopefully we did, and no one stole anything. And like, we had a crappy camera for an AV system. So there's a recording on YouTube that's like all dark and blurry. So it's really amazing to be up here and see like all of this like event stuff go together. So I'd love to everyone give a big round of applause to facilities, events, recruiting, all the people who put this together, because it's like really, really awesome to see kind of how far the company's come. I joined at about 100 people, and we're now 830, give or take. So very, very large change of size. So I'm Brian, in case that wasn't obvious, and I'm going to talk to you about startup job offers. A couple of caveats. Who am I? I've been at Stripe for a little over 3 years now. Before that, I was at Facebook for 2 years. Before that, I had my own Y Combinator startup for a couple of years. So I've kind of seen the entire spectrum of size of company. But also very importantly, things that I am not a lawyer, and I am not an accountant. This does not constitute legal advice. This does not constitute accounting advice. Also, in this particular moment, I'm just me. I'm not actually representing Stripe. They're paying the bills for all this stuff, and they have a pretty slide deck, so their name's in the corner of it. But this is really my personal opinion and doesn't reflect the opinions of my wonderful employer. So, yeah. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you. Who are you? You are the super awesome engineer intern who's being courted by every tech company in the country. They're flying you around. They're wining and dining you to various degrees. Some companies do more of that. We buy you pizza, which I believe for college standards is wining and dining. And trying to get you, hope that you decide that we are the company that you're going to start off your tech career. But there's kind of this big set of decisions you have to make. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to a big or a small company? Do you want to stay on the, well, for me, being from New York, do you want to stay on the East Coast or move to the West Coast? Do you want to join kind of like two of the quintessential like places to land as a computer scientist, finance, or web? I'm sure there's a whole spectrum there, but those are the two that at least I had to pick from. There's a lot of kind of axes to decide on. I'm only going to talk about big or small today because the rest of them are somewhat more personal decisions, and I have a lot of personal opinions, but that's kind of for you to figure out yourself. So, big versus small companies. There are a bunch of axes that I think are important to consider. I'll touch on all of them. Lifestyle, personal growth, salary, and equity. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about equity. Mostly because it's the one that I find new grads tend to know very little about and just kind of treat as a black box. And I think it's fairly misunderstood in a lot of ways. So I'm going to try and kind of give you a very dense but hopefully not too long overview of kind of the nuances of equity. Again, not an accountant, not a lawyer, consult your own. But yeah, please save questions at the end. I'll stop in the middle, and if you're confused about a particular slide, we'll do like, please shout out a question, but the broader bulk questions we'll save to the end. We should have 20-ish, 30 minutes for Q&A, depending on how long I talk. So let's get started. Lifestyle. So this is kind of one of the more hopefully obvious ones. Smaller company, has fewer people. You're going to be a lot tighter knit with those people. You're going to spend a lot more time with them. And you're probably going to end up being friends with them. I find with a startup, there's a lot more of a kind of war buddy kind of attitude to it. And larger companies I find have this also. A lot of it is very varying depending on your team dynamic. There are teams where everyone has that exact mentality. They're really scrappy. They're pushing really hard. There are teams that have a little less urgency. But the interesting thing is that larger companies is going to be much harder to evaluate. There will be kind of an overarching culture, but then you're going to have kind of organizational subcultures. And those are going to be kind of interesting to work with and evaluate. And they're just like a lot harder to get a feel for until you start at a company. So I think with respect to lifestyle, at a smaller company, you can evaluate it a lot more thoroughly. There's a reasonable chance if you're looking at a 10-person company that you can just like talk to literally everyone, and you can kind of see how they work for a little bit, and you can kind of observe this. So larger companies will try to give you an impression of it, but they're not really going to be able to like give you as deep an insight. So it's very important with both companies, kind of how you spend your day-to-day, what your inclinations are in terms of time spent at the office, hours you come in and leave. These are things you can answer and figure out. It'll just be a little more consistent and evaluatable, a small company. It's a small one. So growth. Growth is interesting. I like to always say that like if you want to become the best iOS engineer in the world, like that's the only thing you want to do, you just want to look at iOS, you don't care about learning anything else in the world, you just go join like Facebook or Apple or Google or one of the companies that like ship the like most used iOS apps. The thing that you get with a smaller company is breadth of experience and a really particular set of skills that you have to develop around multitasking and kind of being able to learn, do new things quickly. So whereas a large company, they could potentially support you in developing a huge amount of depth, the smaller you get, the more you're going to need to be a jack of all trades. And that doesn't mean you're not going to learn things. You're both going to learn a lot of little things, like kind of a lot of introduction of how do I spin up an AWS server, or how do I get a CI bot working, or you know, some kind of continuous integration script. But you won't get like an incredible amount of depth because honestly, just a company that's growing quickly, that's small, doesn't need that depth. They need something that works well, and then they'll iterate on later. And I think just being able to determine that point where something is kind of good enough to move on is a very interesting skill. You know, you at a smaller company, you really need to be able to say, this thing will probably last us a year or 2x growth or 3x growth, and that's fine, and I'm going to move on. Because you could always come back to it later and build the 10x growth version of it. So it is an interesting set of skills there. Mentorship is actually, I find both companies, both sizes of companies will often have the same level of mentorship available, or at least it's not really related to size. I think the type of mentorship tends to be pretty varied. Excuse me. The type of mentorship tends to be pretty varied. At a large company, they're going to have a lot of structure in place. They're going to be able to give you assigned mentors, classes, lectures, things like that. Whereas at a smaller company, you hopefully have very smart people working there, but they're going to be busy. And they're not going to proactively seek out people as often and say, hey, how can I mentor you, how you're doing? I would call it more of kind of like a pull culture, where if you're willing to go to someone and say, hey, can you help me sit down and pair program on this? Hey, can you look at my code and give me some feedback? Hopefully the company is nice enough people that they'll take the time and they'll do that, and hopefully you'll be able to evaluate that before you join. But it's going to be, again, you need to proactively go out and seek that. But again, they're both available. It's just really the style of and like kind of level of pushed upon you. Cool. So that's growth. Now let's get to money, everyone's favorite topic. So salary. This may be a totally shocking statement, but big companies pay more cash. Generalizations. If you're looking for the largest amount of dollars that are liquid that you can turn into Xboxes or whatever you kids like these days, you're gonna just like pick the company that has the biggest number, and this is things like yearly bonuses, starting bonuses, relocation packages, free cell phones, 401k matching, fancy laptops, like that kind of stuff. So I'm not gonna say I'm not gonna give you your personal valuation function on how much cash matters to you, but I will prompt the question of how much does it matter. And kind of ask you to personally consider. By the way, one of the things I like about this talk is this is the exact same talk pretty much that I gave 3 years ago when Stripe was 100 people. So I do want to qualify that none of this really has to do with you should particularly join Stripe. This tries to be an objective analysis, but I like that I didn't feel any need to like tweak any information because I think Stripe's a great place to work regardless. But anyway, with that intermission of a pitch. There was a study done in 2009 looking at kind of day-to-day happiness correlated to salary and controlled for all the other variables that you get. And the national benchmark was per household, day-to-day happiness peaks at $75,000. If you earn more money, you're not going to ostensibly be happier day-to-day. Overall happiness, or happiness in spite of like medical bills, like this is certainly not the only metric by which you can derive happiness. There is no single metric, but I found this interesting. If you break it down by city, San Francisco is obviously a ridiculously high cost of living. In 2009, I believe it was $103,000 a year per household, but that's per household, so potentially including a spouse and children and things like that. If you're looking for kind of, this was 2009, so I was 8 years old. More recent studies put Seattle at 105, so if you kind of extrapolate out, you could say 120 for San Francisco, given our current taxation and things like that. Just vague estimates. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that I personally believe there's a diminishing utils of dollars. your first $100,000 that you could make is certainly, much more important than the dollars after it, because those are what provide you the financial stability, the ability to build up a 6-month nest egg, things like that. So without saying where your personal dollar limit should be, because that's none of my business, my suggestion to you is make a budget and to put everything in it. I think a lot of people do their kind of cost of living budget, and it's like, or hopefully, which is like, how much would an apartment be in the area? How much would, car insurance if I have a car? But I think there's also the kind of what lifestyle do you want to live? When you graduate college, you're gonna have like a ton of stuff open to you. You could be the kind of person who travels to Europe once a month, which sounds very, very expensive. You could be the kind of person who buys a new Tesla every 3 years. Like, these are all options, and there's really a question of like what lifestyle you personally would like to live. So I'm recommending that you kind of map that out and figure out what that's gonna cost to maintain. And you can kind of back out a salary number from there. And I'm not saying that's the number you should aim for. I think it can never really hurt to kind of ask for more money. Worst case, they say no, as long as you're not a jerk about it or asking for a ridiculously high number. But figure it out, factor everything in, do all of your math on like what kind of lifestyle you want to live, and then factor in paying off student loans and things like that. The interesting thing that I found from doing this when I was freshly out of college was it really gave you some insight on like the relative cost of things, and especially how much recurring costs grossly like outmatch like one-time costs, like that, spending $100 more on a fancier iPhone versus the like getting wanting to live alone versus with roommates. Alone versus with roommates being, hundreds to potentially even thousands of dollars a month. And it just, it I think helps put things in perspective in terms of what the cost is of your lifestyle preferences, which is fine, but I think at least awareness allows you to make more informed decisions. Cool, so now the fun topic that I'm gonna spend a vast majority of the time on, equity. This is the fuzziest. In my opinion, this is the hardest to evaluate. It's all very subjective. Every company pitches that they're gonna be worth all the money ever. A lot of them are lying, some of them aren't, some of them will be worth all the money. So this is like a very, very hard thing to evaluate. But the first question I tend to get asked here is, here's my equity package, is this a good number? And I think that's like not even necessarily the right question, because like the number alone doesn't mean a ton. There's a lot of context around that number. But for the sake of starting off somewhere and kind of preempting that question, I figured I'd give a little chart. So this is actually pretty out of date. This is Wealthfront used to have a startup salary survey that they would ask kind of how big is your company and what level are you and what's your salary and equity package. There's probably more data available on things like Glassdoor nowadays. I blanked out the salary side of this chart because I don't think it's particularly useful or still relevant. But if you look for like an entry-level engineer here, you can kind of say there's a spectrum of like, at a small company, you're gonna get like 0.1% to 0.5%, perhaps outside that range, for an entry-level engineer, whereas, a smaller company, you'll get anywhere from like 0.01% as like an average, somewhere lower there. So, just to give you an idea of general range, obviously it scales down with number of employees because the amount that you raised, it changes, the amount of risk to the equity changes, the company valuation changes. But just to give you a baseline to kind of frame a lot of this conversation. So for pretty much the rest of the time, I'm gonna go into a glossary. I'm gonna go through seven or 8 terms, I think 8 terms or concepts that I'll spend a bunch of time talking about. It's pretty dense. There's a kind of a lot of stuff here. I'll stop in the middle and let people shout out if they're just totally lost because I talk too fast or something like that. I'm also gonna summarize these at the end, so there'll be a little cheat sheet I'll put up and you can write them all down. So don't worry if you haven't written it down, and then hopefully this will end up on YouTube later, so you'll get all of your chance to hear all of this over and over. Excuse me. So let's go through the main factors. I'm gonna start with the most concrete and then go to the fuzziest. So start off easy. First off is number of shares. If you are going to a small company, or if you're getting an equity offer, there's kind of 2 options. You'll get a number of shares or a dollar value of those shares. If you get a number of shares, there's absolutely no context there. That's a numerator. If they don't tell you the total number of shares the company has outstanding, that just is effectively meaningless. It's like if I go to you and say, hey, I would love to give you 7 for that backpack. Like, 7 what? Is it 7 chickens, 7 slices of pizza? Like, it's a completely meaningless number. So you should always, if you're getting a number of shares, find out how many shares are outstanding. That lets you compute the percent of the company, which is kind of a good basis to compute other things related to your equity, potential upside, expected value, things like that. I have never seen a company that I have any respect for refuse to give this out. I've seen a couple of companies that I don't really respect refuse to give this out when they give you an option number. If they're giving you a dollar amount, it's pretty easy to compute that, so it's like less necessary, so they probably won't do it. But like, it may not come in your original offer, but if you ask for this and they just like flat out refuse, that's a pretty big red flag in my opinion. Yeah. One of the interesting things to note is as we get fuzzier, a lot of the information they may give you is they can't promise. None of this is really concrete. For a number of shares, they should absolutely have. But sometimes, like this is one of the big like out of college things, sometimes it's easier to ask things on the phone because people don't have to worry about their words coming back to haunt them as much. So I've definitely had, you get a startup offer, get on the phone with someone, ask them questions, you'll get a little bit more clarity because they can give you kind of vague estimates or, with the qualification it's a vague estimate and not worry about you as having as much of a case if you sue them later for misrepresentation, for example. So I think it's actually a very valuable thing on the phone or in person if possible. For a number of shares, most companies I believe should have no problem writing this down, or like ability to forward it to a reporter and then that reporter knows the information. Like there's a lot of reasons why like recorded medium is just like a little less pleasant at times. Number of shares again is pretty concrete and less relevant there, but as I go further along, it should become a lot more relevant, to the extent that I don't know any company that would give like some of the later bits of information in writing. So number of shares. Vesting. You may have heard this one. This is a pretty common one. Most vesting that you see is 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff. This means they offer you 100,000 shares, 4-year vesting, 1-year cliff. That means you stay for a year, and on your 1-year anniversary, you'll get 25,000 shares, and then you get the rest over the next 3 years. So at the end of your 4 years, you'll be fully vested, but you have to be there a year to get anything. This is pretty common. I've seen some companies do 3, some companies do 5, but usually you'll see 4-year with a 1-year cliff. But again, the interesting thing here is I'll talk about a lot of terms like RSUs and options. These don't have a perfect legal meaning, or don't quote me on that. These don't mean a specific thing. These mean a general concept, and the actual terms of your paperwork are the specific thing. So you can have an RSU or an option program structured however you want. I can write 4-year vesting, 1-year cliff with like nuanced details as to what that means, and like as long as I spell it out sufficiently clearly in the 40 pages you're going to sign about your option program, it's still there. So while I'll give you the generalizations about how RSUs tend to work or how options tend to work, for example, you should definitely look at the paperwork, and a company can put really anything they want in there within legal bounds. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Excuse me, I've been talking all day. So RSUs versus options, another concept you've probably heard. The kind of simple answer is that small companies tend to do options and larger companies tend to do RSUs. There's a huge amount of complexity in this space. RSUs are logistically easier, whereas options tend to be treated better from a tax perspective. So I'll go into some of the broad generalizations there. So like RSUs conceptually are a restricted stock unit. Usually they manifest as a statement that the company will owe you a share of stock. So I will owe you 1 share of stock whenever my company IPOs or gets sold. The reason they're structured like that is because if they actually gave you the stock, you'd owe tax on that money, and if you have no way to sell that, you're just going to have a huge tax burden. So for the vast majority of still private tech companies, we'll treat it as triggered upon an IPO or sale. And that's when you incur your taxation. Generally, RSUs you get to keep; they're just yours. You have them, though that's not always true. Options, on the other hand. Options, on the other hand, are a right to buy a share of stock. So you are vesting a right to buy a share of stock at a certain price, which means that they are more complicated because at some point you need to actually buy that share. It's not they're giving it to you, they're giving you the right to buy it. The taxation there is much more nuanced and more complicated, but that's kind of why I'm giving this talk, to hopefully give some light to some of that. And again, smaller companies tend to do it. Stripe, for example, at this size, I believe now gives out RSUs. When I joined, they gave out options. It's just something that companies, as they transition to a larger size and a higher valuation, tend to move between. So I'll talk about the differences. These are all different terms depending on if you're talking about options or RSUs, so I'll kind of touch on both of them. Exercise period. This is one of the big ones. Options come in two forms. Stock options come in two forms. Usually what you will get is what's called an incentive stock option, an ISO. This is an incentive for you being an employee as part of their stock program. In order for these to be incentive stock options, they have to meet certain criteria. These criteria include a 90-day post-termination exercise window. It sounds like the most boring term ever. Basically, this means that like when you leave a company, if you haven't bought your options, you have 90 days after you leave to buy your options. So if you stay at your company for a year, they have an IPO, they haven't gotten liquidity, and you leave with options, you may just lose them. Or you may have to give your company a check, give the IRS a larger check, potentially depending on how they're doing. And then you've now put a lot of money out there for something that has no liquidity, so it's possible it might be worthless. It's possible it might be worth a lot, but that's really the conceptual risk is either, if you leave, you might have to fork out some money for a risky asset. Whereas RSUs, for the most part, tend to not have that. So again, an RSU program can be whatever the company wants to put together, but most RSU programs that I've seen, if you leave the company, you just get to keep them. You get to keep the company obligation to give you a stock upon IPO or exit. So that's one of the nice advantages there is you don't have to worry about departure. Again, I've seen some RSU programs not have that and say, oh, we're going to claw them back if you leave, but I think the vast majority do not. So going back to the exercise period for stock options, for ISOs, you have kind of two options. There are two ways that companies tend to deal with this. One is something called early exercise. Some companies will give you the ability the day you join to pre-purchase all of your stock. You don't get or to pre-purchase all of your options. There's some complicated shenanigans to kind of keep the same vesting concept, but generally allows you to kind of front load all of your purchase price. So if the company is worth a penny a share and they give you 10,000 shares, you could give them a check for $100 on your first day and do some paperwork shenanigans, and now you kind of don't really have to worry about it. Not all companies do this. It tends to happen either when they're larger or there's some weirdness around kind of founders and things like that, but that is something some companies have. The other way that companies hang around it is turning those ISOs, those incentive stock options, into a slightly worse taxed form of option called a non-qual, which is kind of outside of a standard employee incentive, but still a stock option. They're taxed worse, but you can hold on to them for 7 or 10 years. I've seen that done in a number of places. It's messy. It's very doable, but it's one of those things that hasn't been around long enough for the entire world to trust it and the entire world to coalesce on the single way that this manifests and the single way to do it. But if a company offers it, I think it is a very good thing because being beholden to a company by handcuffs is just never a good situation if someone's dissatisfied. If someone wants to leave, they should be able to leave. And it's the notion of American at-will employment. So that's exercise period. Does anyone have any quick clarifications they'd like or anything like that before I move on? Go for it. Question is, there's an option to buy. What's the price to buy it at? Good segue. Let's talk about strike price. He's not a plant, I swear. So strike price is literally that. When a company gives you a stock option, this is the option to buy a share in the future at pretty much the present price. The present price is determined by something called a 409A valuation. This is a bank comes in, looks at all your things, does some magic bank math, and craps out a number. So that's called the 409A valuation. So with options, going into more detail about how that purchase thing works, when you have shares vested, you may cut a check for that strike price. So if I'm buying 1,000 shares and the strike price at the time when I join is $1, that's $1,000 I need to give my company as a check to buy those shares. But that's not all your obligation. You also owe the government money. So you have to pay, generally, there's this thing called AMT. Who knows what AMT is? Wow, no one. Oh, you're so lucky. So AMT is this alternate tax system that basically if you have certain forms of income or certain forms of money making, you fall into this alternate tax system that's completely different than the normal tax system. The original goal of it was to try and catch people who make most of their income through investments and get them to pay a fair share of taxes. And it used to be applied to a very, very small percentage of Americans. Now it's I think a double-digit percent. It's become really prevalent because the limits for it haven't caught up with inflation. So basically, if you, let's say you buy that share for $1 a share, those 100,000 shares, but the company, based on their latest 409A valuation, which you have to do every once in a while, is now worth $5 a share. You have technically, according to the government, earned $4 according to the AMT tax system. So you actually have to, you have magicked $4 out of air according to the IRS, and you have to go give them taxes on that $4 a share. So if you join a company that's very small and they become worth a lot, it now becomes financially unviable for you to be able to afford your shares because, like, maybe you have a $1,000 check, but in this particular example, the $4,000 difference in earnings, you owe maybe 35% tax on, give or take. So you now need to go find another like $1,500, $1,800, something like that. So for a company that goes from being for a company that grows a lot and 10x's in value, you could potentially owe a large tax burden. This gets really complicated. This is the point where I went and got an accountant and paid them a lot of money to go figure out the right way to do this. But there's a lot of spreadsheeting involved to kind of not screw yourself, because literally the day you buy the stock, you give your company a check for that $1,000, but you owe the IRS at some point in the next year, potentially quarterly, potentially at the end of the year, a big check. So it's something to be aware of. There's some case, basically, if the company has increased in value enough, you will almost always hit AMT as your tax system and almost always owe this as a thing. So something to be aware of, so there are two reasons why companies switch to RSUs. One is when they increase in value enough, previous employees still can't afford the stock because now they owe less than new employees who might have a higher strike price, but they still owe a lot of money to the government. And then also if you join a company the day of and their strike price is very high, you already owe them a lot of money to even buy your stock. So that's like options. Options have that weird property, which is again what makes them more complicated, which is why I think makes potentially new grads more afraid of them. It's a solvable problem. It's something that you can kind of account for in your risk model and decide if you're comfortable taking that risk. There's no better time to take a risk than when you're young and don't have kids to support or anything necessarily. It's something to take into account. RSUs don't have that property because most RSU programs that pre-IPO tech companies will just not give you the stock until they IPO. So when you get the stock at IPO, they'll immediately sell 45% of it or something like that, or whatever is tax-wise appropriate, and use that to cover your taxes. So you don't even get the full amount of shares. You get the post-tax approximately maybe right amount of shares. Clarifications on that. Go for it. So what happens if the company goes bankrupt? Yes. So what happens if the valuation drops or the company goes bankrupt? I'm not sure. It's complicated. It is conceivable that you would be able to write off some loss on your taxes, but there are limits to the amount that you can write off as losses. So it depends on the exact numbers. It's possible you can reclaim some of your amount in tax credits, but the government's never going to give you money back. So if you give them $100,000, in future years you haven't paid $100,000 in taxes, you're almost certainly going to end up paying taxes for something you're not going to reclaim. So I believe there is some positive reclaiming, but it's fuzzy, and I'm not an accountant for the third time. I don't want to get sued. Cool. Go for it. So that difference can be taxable? I'm not going to repeat the question because the answer implies it. When you exercise your options, you owe taxes. So if I have my options, I'm here for a year, I have the option to buy a share, but you haven't actually bought the share yet. So you don't owe taxes until you actually purchase your options. And that's when you owe taxes on this non-publicly traded thing, because the 409A valuation is effectively the government's decision of the value of this asset, based on banks and voodoo magic. So yeah, you will owe taxes on something that you ostensibly cannot sell. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah, so I alluded to it vaguely that non-quals, the potential thing that some companies do, which convert ISOs into non-quals, non-qualified stock options, gives them a worse tax treatment because they're taxed effectively as income. It's like the company's just paying you more, not giving you an investment vehicle. It's not entirely correct, close enough. So whereas an ISO, if you buy it and with an ISO, you can get a fair amount of your value realized in what's called capital gains, which is taxed as income appreciation, or I'm sorry, investment appreciation. that's like taxed 15% or 25%, depending on how long you hold it. And California throws in 10 because why not? Whereas, for a non-qual, you're looking at income, which is more like 45% after California takes its cut, depending on your income bracket. Was that what you were alluding to? Cool. Okay, awesome. So that's strike price. And again, so strike price is interesting because a company won't promise a strike price because you actually don't, if they have options, you won't actually get your options until the board of directors meets again, possibly after you start. Because the board of directors needs to sign a piece of paper saying we're giving all these people these options and this is fine, yay. And so if by the time between the time you sign your offer and the time you start, the company raises a round or does various other things that cause them to get repriced, then you could have a different strike price. And again, a lower strike price is ostensibly much better for you. So that's why a company won't promise it. A company can say, here's our current strike price, but they really don't want to inadvertently imply that's the strike price you're going to get because that would be lying to you, which is why it's easier to get them on the phone because they can be a little more careful about their wording and not have to worry it. I think a bunch of companies will probably just email that nowadays, but it's kind of starting the point of, for the rest of these things, they're not really promising anything. Companies, RSUs, for example, companies will sometimes promise you a dollar value. So even public companies, I think, will promise you just a dollar value of stock from the day you start or something like that. And that way you don't have to do math on, well, what if it goes up or down, especially for new grads where you could accept your offer in November and not start until May or June. There could be a large variation, so something to keep in mind. Dilution. Dilution. So when a company raises more money, those shares have to come from somewhere. So if you talk to a company, they say, we're giving you 1,000 shares, we have 100,000 shares outstanding, you have 1% of the company, you can't just assume that at IPO time, because the company's clearly going to do amazing in IPO, you're going to get 1% of all of that money. The board of directors can make more shares appear out of thin air pretty much whenever they want. So this is called dilution. So if a company raises a bunch of money and needs to issue shares, sometimes the founders will sell some of their shares and pocket some money, but realistically a lot of it tends to come from issuing new shares. So if you have a company that raises $1 million and at a $5 million post-money valuation, they have just given away 20% of their company. That could ostensibly just come from turning that 100,000 shares into 125,000 shares and just giving those 25,000 new shares to their investor. And now instead of having 1%, you have whatever that maths out to, which is lower than 1%. So it's a question to ask. I think more of it just shows your knowledge of things. A company's not going to really be able to promise anything here because it depends on their future raise and their terms of their future raise. But it's worth having a discussion of look, what does your money look like? Are you going to need to raise a ton? If you're in a incredibly capital-heavy business, where you have to expand into markets by throwing a ton of money at it, let's say to pay drivers of vehicles or something, you end up needing to raise a ton of cash. And that can be debt, where it's things that you pay back with interest, or it can be equity-based, where you give out more of the company. But especially in the equity-based case, you might not have as much as you think. So understanding what their last raise was, how long it's going to last them, how much they're going to need to raise more, are they intending to be cash flow positive soon? They're good questions to ask. I don't think there's a lot of numbers you can put around it, but it's good to get a feeling of this. Yeah. Cool. Dilution. Liquidation preference. So this is a fun one. This, hopefully, if the company does well, won't really apply to you, I hope, but it is interesting. So I'll talk about it. Not all shares are created equal. So if an investor invests $1 million in that $5 million post-money company that I talked about earlier, there's this kind of, they want to minimize their risk. They ideally want to 10x their money, but they also want to minimize the chance they don't get their money back. So one of the ways they do this is liquidation preference. Liquidation preference means that when it's time to cash out, when it's time to give everyone their money, sometimes the investors will get their money first. So there are two types here. The common type that you will see is what's called non-participating preferred, which is basically the company, the investor will get a multiple of their money back or the percent they have, whichever is higher. So if I put $1 million in and I have a 2x liquidation preference and that $5 million company sells for $7 million, the first thing that happens is I get $2 million. And then everyone else gets the rest. So the 80-ish% of the company that's left gets split amongst that 5 million. So the investor is now getting more, which is a great way for them to reduce their risk. but it also means that, if you're not really an investor in the same way because your model of what the expected value of the company is very different. The way this manifests is like, it's interesting to think that like, when raising money, I think everyone assumes that you want to raise at the highest valuation possible. You don't really. There are a lot of reasons why you might want to raise at a lower valuation. You want your investors to be aligned with you on values. You want future rounds to be higher, not lower, because if you end up raising at a really aggressive valuation and then the market takes a downturn and now you raise at a lower valuation, that's really bad signaling. And everyone's like, oh, that company's not doing well. So it's something, there are a lot of reasons why you might try to keep valuation lower, but if a company's trying to pump their valuation up as much as possible for whatever reason, a good way to get investors to agree to a higher valuation is to give them a higher liquidation preference because it reduces their downside risk. So in the event of, selling for not zero, but not, kind of the full amount, liquidation preference takes care of that. There's a worse kind of liquidation preference called participating preferred, where first they get their money back and then they also get their cut of the money that's left. I haven't really seen that in a while, and I think like the investors have to be it has to be a weird situation, I think, for that to really be a thing worth doing. But you don't know. These kinds of things are one of the reasons why like I think really good, like really well-known investment firms are really well-known. Like they try to be more partners than like take advantage just for the sake of boosting their portfolio. Because like if you look at your Sequoias and your Excels of the world, they deal in like 20-year reputation base. Like their entire business is what kind of deals do we get access to? Because if you have the next Stripe, let's say, there are a lot of people who want to invest. So being able to go and, like having a firm that has a great reputation is very important for getting access to deals like that, at least in the broad sense. So, for them, they don't really want to screw over they don't really want to screw over employees because those employees may go on to found companies. They don't really want to screw over founders because those founders might found new companies or talk to friends or things like that. So I tend to have a lot of faith that like your really good firms just like don't do sketchy things with liquidation preference because it's just like, not worth it in terms of like 10-year reputation in the Valley. I like to think to help myself sleep at night that the Valley is really small and just like people who are jerks just like kind of, this is not necessarily a jerkish thing, but like people who are jerks, like word just gets around and it like hurts them in very small immaterial ways. I'm not sure how true that is. That might just help me sleep at night, but I like to think it's true. So. Cool. Investor and founder pressures. Again, the fuzziest of the fuzzy. This is the last one. What do the decision makers want? There's kind of this interesting question of, what is the company likely to do? Is the company likely to try and sell for $10 million? If you have 1% of that company and they sell for $10 million, you get $100,000. Is that really like the exit that you're trying to get? The upside is basically based on what the founders are going for. If their founders are trying to build a company that IPOs, that's a very different thing. And personally, I don't actually think there's shame in either of those. If a company wants to build a useful service and sell it to a larger company that has the resources to support it, like that's great, but I think you should know going into it, because if the company ends up selling and you're expecting them to push for an IPO and you make, $100,000, which is like not really a down payment on a house in San Francisco, as unfortunate as it is, like that's fine and that's a great chunk of change, but you shouldn't really be surprised by it, and I think that would be unfortunate. Now, everything changes. You don't know what's going to happen over the next however many years. That company will probably be a completely different company in a year anyway, but getting an idea and feeling like you're on the same page with the founders or whoever controls all these decisions is, I think, a pretty useful thing. Especially when you think of things like if you have options, when might there be liquidity? Is the company going to try to stay private as long as possible? Are they really just gunning for an IPO, which is good in that it gives you liquidity, but bad in that you might pump up numbers? Like, it's hard to make decisions based on this information, but personally I just like knowing more because it can't really hurt too much. So, clarifications on any of that. We'll do like full-length questions at the end, but anything anyone wants me to clarify? Cool. You want? Go for it. So the question is, why would you pre-purchase options if the strike price is locked in? So that's a program called early exercise usually. The reason you might do that is to avoid your tax penalty, because if you buy your shares right away, I'm not sure if you need to file special paperwork. You might need to file an 83B. I'm not sure. It's a tax document. But you can basically say, okay, I want to be taxed on all of this right now. And then if the company goes up in value, you're just already holding the shares. So it's more tax optimization. You still have to cut that same exact check to the company. Cool. So Glossary, like I said, you kind of have your more concrete things. Any company should be able and willing to tell you, you should be able to figure out from your paperwork too, do you have RSUs versus options? What's the vesting period? What's the post-termination exercise? Do I get to keep my shares? And how many shares are outstanding? Excuse me, or what's the value of my shares, which is kind of a vague equivalent question. And then you have your fuzzier things. They can't promise a strike price. They can't promise an expected dilution. They can't promise any, or like, they'll give you an idea of liquidation preference, but like generally, that's relatively quiet information, and like they might not broadcast it too loudly. And then like kind of what the founders are going for. These aren't really things that you can, that you're going to get someone to commit to in writing or a contract or anything. But if you have an idea of it, it just might help your picture of the situation. Go for it. So the question is, at what point do the options get confirmed? So when you sign on, I believe the thing that you generally sign is an agreement to the employee stock purchase plan, which is the structure under which your options will be given, and then a statement that you will get these number of shares at the next, after the next board meeting. So you actually don't even get, your options don't exist. Like the thing you're signing is a program, not like the receipt of that option, specific option structure. So that might happen. I mean, boards meet frequently enough, and so it'll happen relatively quickly, usually, but it's not actually on the date that you sign or the date that you start necessarily. Cool. Go for it. Yeah, so the question is, there's, some companies that stay private for a long time end up doing a buyback program of some kind, and what factors would you think of there? They're not that hard to math. You can kind of it's what do you think the company might be worth? What's the expected value of the company in the future? What can you do with the money today? Things like that. A good example of something that I've seen, if you believe the taxation gets really weird, but something I've heard of some people doing is, you sell some of your stock and use it to exercise the rest of your ISOs if you think the company's gonna be worth a lot of money, which might be a good tax optimization. But again, I think it ends up being build yourself a crap ton of spreadsheets. Yeah, so especially if a company has a liquidity program, then it probably is offering it to multiple people. And the thing that I really don't love about equity and salaries and things like that is that they end up being fairly quiet. I understand that there are very, very good reasons for it, and I haven't figured out a better way to not lead to animosity amongst employee programs. But it's kind of unfortunate that there are a bunch of people in a liquidity program or something like that going through the same thing and not talking to each other. So I know plenty of people that when companies have programs like that, chat with each other. You have friends who are going through the same thing. It's sometimes awkward to talk about numbers, and I'm not going to say people haven't lost friends over it. It certainly happens, but personally, I tend to err towards openness amongst friends. I'm not going to broadcast things to the company, but openness amongst friends, I tend to like. Go for it. Yeah, what are the rules for selling your options on a secondary market? So if you bought the stock, you're now physically holding a share of stock. You need to have the stock to sell it, unless you don't, but that's weird. Most companies, I believe, that are of a sufficient size will prevent you from doing so, and but it is in the contract, to answer your specific question. They will not allow you to sell in the secondary market. But yeah, it's dependent on the nuance of your particular contract. Cool. That's the glossary. I'll put this up at the end again as a cheat sheet, so if you want to copy it down, don't worry if you're not writing fast enough. The big question that everyone says is, yay, you've given me a lot of information, but really I just want to know how much money we're going to make when we IPO, because you have so much faith that your company's going to have this big, awesome IPO and someone's going to hit that big button on the stock market. So there's kind of two answers here that I tend to give. One is you can math the crap out of this and figure out the expected value and the percent ownership you have, take off dilution, and then multiply by the strike price and take that off as a purchase price. This ignores taxes, by the way. This is not really perfectly accurate. But I don't like that answer. The answer that I really like is whatever the hell the board of directors decides you're going to make. This is this manifests in some interesting stories. I think there were some shenanigans here with the social network, not commenting on whether or not that's true about Facebook, but the board of directors can do a lot of things. They can issue a ton of shares, as we talked about with dilution. They can, sell the company for a low amount of money, and they have a fiscal responsibility of the company to try and make the shares worth as much as possible, but there's a lot of subjectivity to that. So that's my big thing, is that it really, really comes down to how much you trust the founders of the company. Are they, like I said, are they going to sell just to get out because they're going to make their couple of $1 million, which is great for them and might be good for you, but is that, you should understand that, or are they trying to IPO? If you don't trust the founders of your company and kind of the decision makers of your company, I would kind of question what you're doing joining them in the first place. I wouldn't have joined Stripe if I didn't trust John and Patrick. Like, it was just kind of a prerequisite because I understand that like this is all such like in-flight math that changes over time, that if you don't trust them to make these decisions that impact your finances, like you have to. Like there's nothing else you can do here if you're going to join a smaller company. So that's pretty much it. Like I said, I do derive some comfort in knowing that in my belief that the valley is self-correcting. If someone really screws someone else over, hopefully it gets around and it's like this tangible notion of karma to me. I'm not sure if that's true or if it helps me sleep at night, but that's for you to decide. My other piece of advice is in picking kind of your personal job offer, don't overthink it. I think a lot of people often get to like, they have two offers that both seem fair, they're both about equivalent, they're different companies, and they really can't decide, and they angst and they stress over it. I know I had the exact same situation. I heard somebody say, somebody said that when you're trying to make a really tough decision, flip a coin. Not because you should randomize it and just like do something random, but because while that coin's in the air, you kind of have this like gut, like, I hope it lands on heads or something like that. And like, if you have two offers that are like so close, you really like can't decide between the two of them, go where you think you're gonna have more fun, go where, where you think it's worth trying out. Like, it's not gonna be hard to switch companies if you're a good engineer in the Valley. Like, there are a bajillion tech jobs here. So I don't think it's as like crazy stressful decision. Yes, it will potentially change like some amount of your life in some way, in the friends that you meet, but you can't control for that. So try not to stress too much. I remember when I was thinking of leaving Facebook, I was like considering like the Facebook, like my current Facebook offer and my Stripe offer, and I was like, I angsted for weeks over this because there are plenty of good opportunities at Facebook, and I still love the company, but Stripe was exciting. I knew a lot of the people there, and I believed truly that they would grow, and they have completely delivered on that, as you see by this 830-person office. And I was talking to my mom and angsting over this decision, and she's like, Brian, when you talk about Stripe, I hear this like thing in your voice, like this kind of passion in your voice and excitement. So we both know you're going to take Stripe, and clearly she was exactly right. So, yeah, don't stress the math. Understand the math, look at it, but don't stress over it too much. Cool. Happy to take questions. We have the lovely Hillary running mics around for us, I believe. Oh, and by the way, this is recorded. Feel free to ask anything you want. If you want to like give an offer, I'm happy to talk numbers, like to whatever extent I feel comfortable doing so, but keep in mind this might end up on YouTube. One over here.
Is founders' equity more preferential to the equity that you get as an employee?
Depends on the program. You can structure equity with as many tiers of preference as you want with like voting rights or exercise rights. My inclination is I don't think so generally because there's like no huge need to, because you might as well form one bucket because the founders have control because they'll have more than 50% anyway. But you can structure a program however you want.
How's it going?
Thank you. How are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Good.
So I have a question is, I know you talked primarily about smaller companies. What advice do you have, or excuse me, private companies? What advice do you have for someone that would be comparing between like a public company and a private company?
Yeah, I think public companies are a lot easier to value because it's liquidity. You can effectively treat the money they're giving you as cash, modulo your expectation that the company would grow. So larger public companies tend to have more like more comp packages than just equity and cash. So they'll have bonus structures, they'll have relocation packages, as I said, things that you can like kind of figure out your total dollar amount. But the nice thing is, at the end, you kind of know what that dollar amount is. I think there's kind of two pools of thought there. My friends, which are treated as cash because it's like you could sell it the day you get it available. And then my mom's view, which is hold on to it and hope it makes you rich because you hope the stock goes up a lot. I just treat it as kind of what do I think their stock's gonna be worth in a year and treat it as cash off of that.
This is a pretty weird question, but like if you want to kind of diversify from like, because all of your income is coming from this one source, right? Including your stock. So is there any way to like gain some liquidity of your options so that if you want to diversify?
Yeah, so the question is there any way to gain liquidity off your options? Most options programs will not allow that, I believe. Like there's this like, the company has the right to not let you do it in the same way they have the right to not let you sell your stock. and if like trying to work around that will probably piss off the company if they don't intend to do it. I have heard of people like having rich friends who like buy some stock. It's all sketchy and like, so that's not really a way. There are some VC firms who will kind of have a fund where all of their portfolio companies throw in a couple of percent and they kind of distribute this out. I think it's probably to like founders and super early employees, and that's a good way to kind of diversify and give an extra perk for picking that firm. It's not immensely common, but it does exist. But yeah, RSUs have the advantage of like you can just sell them and go buy something else with the money.
Quick follow-up, do you know which VCs particularly offer something like that?
I am sure they've blogged about it, so I would do some Googling. I don't know off the top of my head.
Hi. So of the options that get listed, besides just the number of shares, what are the most negotiable parts of it? Like, can you like if you had to do that, should you negotiate like the vesting cycle? Should you the cliff? Like, what do you recommend?
Yeah, the shares, absolutely. The stock option program pretty much, usually I will see fills in everything except for the number of shares. So it's like, there's potentially some flexibility, but I haven't really heard of people negotiating like, oh, well, let's do a 3-year vesting. If you have a really small startup that's like really excited about you, you can kind of put anything on the table, but I think just the pure number of shares are often more negotiable. You could potentially do something strange, like if the company, is not sure about you or there's risk, you can like, backload the shares. Like you can do whatever vesting you want. So there are companies who could do like 10% first year, 20% second year, like things like that. But by and large, I always see, I pretty much only see negotiation in terms of number of shares.
So are things like selling on secondary markets, is that something that's usually negotiable and stuff, if you have knowledge about it?
Very, very rarely in my experience. The problem with selling things to other people is once someone holds shares of your stock, they now have the right to some of your financials, and many startups don't want their financials getting out. So I think it's something that people really don't like doing. Yeah, I haven't heard of anyone really negotiating that ever. The other thing is I've seen some people do shares for really small companies, shares based on milestones. So for example, if you're doing something more contracting with a startup, maybe they won't want to just give you a bunch of shares, but like shares based on deliverables. And you can do that however you want. It's, I get this many share options given to me once I finish building the system or something like that. I've definitely seen that, but that's more of like a consulting kind of arrangement or advisorship that I've normally seen it. Yeah, so the question is, as an intern / approaching new grad, what kind of resources, books, et cetera, might be valuable to learn more? There are some VCs that have good overviews. Like actually, if you Google like RSUs versus options, Wealthfront has a decent introduction on their blog. They're a kind of investment vehicle that they do a bunch of blogging. So they had the survey that I had up there, the chart with the equity amounts. I like them. There are some VCs, I think First Round Capital might have a couple. So I think Google around, if you recognize a VC firm that has a blog and that like, that VC firm has had a lot of really solid investments, they have experience seeing how a lot of large companies that you may be looking at offers from exist. So that's not a bad resource. There's a recommended book called Venture Deals by Brad Feld. Yes. Brad Feld, that is recommended. Other questions?
Hi, have you ever experienced a case where during IPO a company will pressure employees not to liquidate their shares to preserve images of stability or otherwise?
IPOs have lockup periods for employees, so I'm not sure how universal it is. I don't know the exact SEC regulation, but generally I believe you have a 6-month lockup period, so to avoid exactly that. So you have kind of 6 months, and by 6 months everything's stabilized. So I think Snap might have recently had that where like the 6-month lockup was approaching and they're like, is everyone gonna jump ship? And I think they may have gone down like 1% or something, but not like a massive amount. So it seems like the 6-month lockup was valuable there. Cool, I think that about does it for questions. I'll be around after if you wanna ask me anything specific that's not on the video. I'm happy to chat. But yeah, thanks for coming everyone.